Manawa mai te Māori nuku, manawa mai te Māori rangi, ko te Māori ke aho te Māori tupua, ka pākaru mai te pau, humie huie taikie. Kia ora koutou everybody, and welcome to this iPEN webinar. This one is actually it's iPEN presenting to you. As you may be aware, normally we've got someone else coming in and presenting to you, but this is a bit of work that we completed a year ago now. And it's been a really useful piece of work that we've found helpful in terms of guiding a lot of the work that iPEN's been doing. So we thought maybe it was about time that we shared it with everyone. We have shared it previously in some of our newsletters, but you know, often people don't have the full time to read through everything. So sharing with you what we've found through this piece of work. I'm going to hand over to Ross in just a second, who'll give a little bit more of a background, and then he and I are going to go backwards and forwards a little bit through the course of the presentation. For those of you who don't know, my name is Cara Skelly-Irvine, and I'm part of the wider iPEN team, providing sort of external advice and expertise and support, along with Chanel, who many of you will know. But otherwise, over to you, Ross, to introduce yourself and introduce the session.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. I'm Ross Lawrence. I work at Manana Ki Whenua, but in this context, I'm the chair of iPEN. Very much like to point out at this stage that this work here was actually really quite a challenging, difficult piece of work. Very rewarding, really interesting, and it was very much a team effort from everyone in iPEN. I'll show you a slide here. You'll probably recognise some of those faces there. You know, and within this, there was a real core team of some real experts, and they included the likes of Tracy Williams from Plant and Food, Sudesh from ESR, who really added a lot in terms of systems thinking, many other people deeply involved. So I'd just like to acknowledge the whole team. Did you want me to talk about this stuff, Cara, or did you want to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, why don't you do that, and then I can hand over to the background.
Okay, cool. So iPEN started in 2014, so we're nearly coming up to our 10-year anniversary now. It's been a great collaboration. Our focus is actually trying to increase the impact of the CRIs. We report directly to the CEs, and we kind of conceptualized it originally as turbocharging impact. It's taking from what CRIs do well and trying to make it better. And we collaboratively work together. The power of the collaboration is we get to share knowledge and we get to share resources, which means we're all collectively producing better quality kind of resources and material than we would individually at a cheaper price. So it's always a good selling point. And yeah, we've got that kind of KISS principle in here. Hey, we're not trying to do anything too complex. We're a pretty pragmatic group, so we're just trying to look at some really simple things.
Cool. Okay, background. Yeah, so I'll run you through a wee bit of the background. So as Ross said, although iPEN started in 2014, the real kind of meaty work that iPEN has been doing was really kicked off in sort of 2017, 2018, when they sought support from the CEs to deliver sort of a more formal program of work, which is what iPEN delivers today. And that's the point at which I came on board in my kind of expert and advisory capacity. And when I first came on board, one of the first things that we did, and I advised that we needed to do, is we needed to understand, well, where are we starting from? What's the starting point? And we did a needs analysis across all the 7 CRIs. And off the back of that, we sort of designed our approach and framework to building capability. And you can see here that really recognised that in terms of building capability, there's kind of a nested structure. And so at the core there has been building capability of individuals and teams, and then that extends out to groups and organisations, and then to the wider system. So the core focus of iPEN's work was always at in the first instance building individual and team capacity and capability, and as we were saying there, to some extent groups and organisations. But when we were doing the initial needs assessment, there was actually a whole bunch of other kind of themes that were picked up that were either helping or getting in the way of people being able to deliver their impact. And Ross, there we go. And so, but these were very much at that wider systems level. And so we kind of were aware of those, and once we had got all of the workshops and a lot of the other tools and templates and the webinars and all of that kind of thing rolling and set up, we felt obliged to return to those challenges and those issues that people had raised, sort of from an ethical and sort of professional point of view, that we couldn't ask people questions and then sort of not make any efforts to try and circle back and address those. And so that was really the basis and the rationale for kicking off this piece of work. Do you want to just bring up the next slide? There we go. So what we obviously we needed to scope it at a level that was actually achievable for us, because iPEN is a collaborative group of people who all only have small amounts of time to be able to devote to these things. And even someone like myself and Chanel, we even our involvement in iPEN is part-time. And so we thought, well, we can't sort of try and consume the whole elephant around what might be the systemic challenges. So our first focus from a scope point of view was that we were very much interested in the CRI perspective. That's who iPEN represents first and foremost, and those are the in terms of what we might be able to do from an iPEN perspective to support that. That was the level at which we could, sort of sensibly target any follow-up actions, not knowing what they might be. The way that we went about this piece of work was grounded in evaluation and systems thinking. So that's where, not just myself, we've got quite a diverse range of experience across iPEN. But for myself and Sudesh, we both have backgrounds in systems thinking. So for me and for Sudesh, we could see that bringing a systems lens to this was just a natural and obvious thing to do. And with both myself and others in the team having background in evaluation also, just for me, I often describe it as that's a good way of bringing some pragmatism to the approach, as opposed to what the approach we might take if we were doing a more sort of pure research piece of research. What we did was we did a bunch of semi-structured interviews with a selection of researchers. We did interview people from all 7 CRIs, and the focus was very much on identifying researchers that had been identified or had been recognised as impactful. And there was a good reason for that. It's a little bit like if you interview parents, they can tell you what it's like to be a parent. You can't interview people who don't have children to know about what's the experience like of being a parent. So it was quite a purposeful decision in that first stage to interview people who had experience in being impactful and had been recognised as such. So we did multiple rounds of validation around our emerging findings and analysis, because we were primarily because we recognised that there could be a view that we might have defined the scope so tightly that actually what we were finding people might dismiss or say, oh, no, that's not really relevant for us. And so because we wanted this to be as useful as possible, we really placed a strong focus on sharing what was coming out and sense checking that not only with people within our CRIs, but increasingly as we went out, we sought feedback from other individuals and entities in the research science innovation system who were able to also bring their perspective and give feedback on that. We'll come to that a wee bit later. And so that included MB, URON. So URON stands for the University's Research Offices of New Zealand, HRC, so the Health Research Council, and KiwiNet. And we went back to these people on multiple occasions. Another thing just to bear in mind is that when we kicked this work off, it was actually prior to the announcement of the Te Ara Pairangi work. So sometimes we like to think that, oh, maybe we were, you know, we got very lucky with the timing because although we kicked this off to serve iPEN's kind of core objectives around supporting building capability for, you know, throughout the system, certainly we recognise that as you know, as we were getting this work underway and we were starting to hear about what Te Ara Pairangi was going to be about, we recognised that there was probably going to be some value out of what we found, and so we sought to really we made real efforts to make sure that various people within MB were very much part of those sort of iterations of sense making, as it often gets called. To make sure that what we were finding out was multiple people in MB in particular were aware of and might be able to feed into their own processes. The other final point is that we recognised right from the outset that you know, the Te Ao Māori perspective was absolutely critical. But it wasn't something that we were able to fully explore as part of the scope of this, which is very much also one of our key boundary limitations around the work that iPEN does as well. So we did find out some really useful, a whole theme came out around that. And so that's really useful information, but we have to be really clear that that is also a key scope constraint and a limitation of the work, that really, if this was to be explored from a Te Ao Māori perspective, that would require another process. Over to you, Ross.
Okay, thank you, Cara. So as we did our research, we came up with a number of themes, which we kind of see as enablers. So these are the areas we can look at to create a better environment for research in New Zealand to lead to real world impact. So I'm just going to run through those themes over the next 15 minutes or so. And Cara's going to come in and have a look at them, what they mean from a systems perspective. Also, at the outset, too, I'd like to point out that CRIs are already really good at delivering impact. We think they do really well. This is about making good better. And also that each of these themes I'm about to talk about is actually a really complex issue in itself. You know, we could have had a series of 7 webinars, one on each theme, to be honest. So you see that little, the iPEN home, there's the iPEN webpage, which I assume most people would be familiar with or have access to because they're here. So you can go to that site, search the word systems, and it will be the first thing that comes up on the page, and there's detail in there. On that note too, because I'll be going over them quickly, don't get hung up in the detail, just think of them as a whole. And be aware too that they're really interrelated and crossover. You know, some things we talk about fit in one place or the other, and there's a lot of connections there, but we think this is a good way to make sense of it. And I've been really interested, Cara and I'll be really interested after we both finish talking, when we're discussing this, as to how much this kind of resonates or you relate to it. So, and the other thing I'm really keen to point out is we've designed this work and what we're talking about to be applicable at all scales. What I find sometimes is you kind of think, oh, it's systems work, these are the things, this is about the kind of Te Arapara system level type stuff. But actually, it's equally applicable whether you're a project manager or a mid-level manager in a CRI or the CE, whether you're running a portfolio of research. So a kind of request today as we're going through this work, mentally moving up and down between these scales, because that's really important, because there's some things that system-wise you can't control, but there's other things that within your current work that we hope you'll see that you can control. So it's a good kind of perspective to keep in mind. We'll keep that kind of little discipline in mind as you go through. Okay, so the first theme is it's really important to participate in all the activities involved in impact creation. And actually, a key thing is that key finding from the researchers is that it takes time and support beyond just doing the research. So as I put up these slides, you'll note that we've got a couple of key points. I've put up quotes from our research. So I encourage you to kind of skim read over those quotes, and I'll just make a few key points. So the research is, we recognise there's a broader range of activities, from building relationships to co-development to, creating outputs for different audiences, to navigating pathways that are really important for delivering real world change. But many of these activities aren't kind of routinely considered or supported. We do a lot of them. We do a lot of them well, but I wouldn't exactly call it systematic. It's not always consistent that people know how or are aware, or the things and the funding in place around to support them to do that. So you see some of the key messages from their quotes. Make sure you plan for impact right at the outset. It takes time and money to have impact, and it takes a broader range of skills than we might normally think of as a kind of a research project. And there's a whole range of reasons why researchers can be driven away from some of these activities, and these should show up in these kind of following themes. So the next theme is around funding stability with flexibility. This is one of the two of the more complex ones, or comprehensive ones. So the first one is kind of information is kind of around the stability. And what we heard is impact is often bigger than individual projects. So we kind of have we hear often about people to address big issues or themes having to cobble together a lot of small bits of funding or projects to create that bigger picture. And actually, that not only creates an admin burden, but it also means that you can't properly plan a comprehensive piece of research, because it relies on the ability and maybe a bit of luck to pull everything together you need to actually produce that big change, that impact you're after. And we're all challenged to secure resources over a lengthy piece of research and pathway to impact. So you need that stability, but on the other hand, you need flexibility. And because relative doing a lot of research is that you need to be responsive and adaptable as you go. So you can't always predict the pathway or the challenges where the research takes you, and often there's changing needs and involvement of stakeholders. So it's kind of one of those tensions about needing the stability but the flexibility. And you can kind of see some of that stuff come up in some of the contracts we have, where you might have a 5-year contract that's great stable funding, but within that contract there's not the milestones and outputs become very set, so you lose some of that flexibility around what you're doing, and you end up doing variations, or you end up feeling like you're kind of constrained. It's a really interesting theme in itself, and I think the next iPEN webinar, or the one after that, might be talking about some alternative funding models that are part of the picture of addressing this. One thing I didn't point out earlier too is that not all of these themes and things I'm talking about will apply to every piece of research. And some of the research we do is very much on a contractual basis. It is necessarily transactional, straightforward research. Other things are different lengths and different sizes. So these are kind of generalizations. So
yeah.
And so basically, in this one, the main message we heard is that funding sources that are flexible and stable create a much more enabling environment for us to deliver impact.
Yeah.
The other fairly complex theme is around relationships. I remember presenting on this last year and saying, if we just say one message from all of this research is relationships are key. I think without a doubt, every researcher, every bit of our research pointed to this. And working with stakeholders is the most effective way to have impact. I'll just let you briefly look at those, but you're doing things for the people, and so you need to work with the people. Is how someone here beautifully phrased it. So they're key, but the issue is, of course, that that relationships take time and money, and therefore money, and often resources aren't provisioned for that. We know in this kind of environment where we're in at the moment, where you're kind of going from one piece to another, you don't necessarily have that long time frame and that long ability to really engage with stakeholders and build that trust. So you end up with it can end up with what some people describe as a transactional relationship. But you can't just stop and start relationships. It just really doesn't work that way. For them to be effective, they need to be worked on and maintained outside the boundary of the actual project. And in here too, you notice in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little quote there, just reminding ourselves too that relationships aren't just with partners, end users, etc. It's about the relationships we have with each other as well to solve problems. So I think effectively what people were talking about is their relationships of the grease, if you like, that makes the impact from science really work. But there isn't much of that funding for that grease at the moment, or time or funding. The next theme was around power and reward structures, and you'll see there that kind of subheading there saying, there's a pretty common dilemma we heard about. Do I try and aim for recognition, my personal science recognition and the reward that goes for that, or do I aim for impact? So when we're talking about reward, we're talking about things that like further funding or peer approval, citations, career progression, and that tends to be biased towards kind of the sciencey side of things, but also what's in relation to that, what's more easily managed and measured, what's valued and measured. So for example, the citation metrics, and that is often one thing that comes up in contracts. And actually, you hear a lot of researchers feeling like they do get little recognition and acknowledgement for the work they do in the impact space. And around that, we hear the phrase "publish or perish," and that's not necessarily doesn't necessarily sit well with things.
Ross, can I just jump in there? Just and add one other thing there, which
most welcome.
So for someone like myself my training is in science, but having worked in evaluation for over a decade now, I've worked across quite a range of different sectors. And this is a particularly perverse challenge in the science and research sector. So whilst, if it's in the health sector, education, there are many similar factors kind of at play that are sort of holding people or pushing people forwards in terms of programs being more or less effective. But the the progression that is tied to individual recognition on the basis of peer-reviewed articles at a very individual level is unique to our research and science system. In no other sort of setting really do you have that kind of extra dynamic, really, in many cases, it's kind of wind blowing you in the opposite direction to where you might be wanting to go. So I think that it's I think it's useful to recognize that this is a particularly challenging dynamic for this sector in particular.
Yeah, and power and reward structures do alter behaviour. We see that the great example there, Cara was talking about the KPI or the metrics around citations and what that drives and the behaviour that drives. But also, we heard things that's kind of like the system level, ecosystem level, if you like. But also we heard things along the lines of, in my performance appraisal, there wasn't much talk about how well you engaged or how well you communicated with stakeholders. It was more about the papers you published where. So, again, keep kind of those levels in mind about what you can and can't manage yourself.
Yeah.
This is an interesting one, about when there's tension between the motivations and beliefs of individuals and entities in the system, it can create quite a tension. In our research that led into this bit of research, we completed a survey, and overwhelmingly researchers said that the reason they come to work is because they want to deliver impact. They want to make a real world impact. So we know researchers are strongly motivated to deliver impact. But in relation to the previous thing, a lot of the signals and the KPIs and that coming out of the system actually tend to focus on the other aspects, on financial performance or getting things done on time, excellence, etc., etc. So I think the signals and processes in the current system don't align with the rhetoric. So I think we get signals from agencies, from the government, this is all about impact, it's mission-oriented research and things like that. But actually, a lot of the systems and processes, like the contracts I mentioned earlier, actually don't back up that rhetoric. It pushes you can push you in a slightly different direction in the funding systems. And I don't think that's even a conscious thing, to be honest. I think that's just a kind of a system evolution thing that we need to be looking at. And that does create a real tension. Researchers kind of reported they get a bit confused at times and frustrated with what they're supposed to do. Or like the top right-hand quote here, there's kind of a bit of rule bending going on, so they can actually make impact because they have to fight against the system or some of the systems and processes to do that. And we know some activities that people want to do aren't just happening because of various funding constraints. There's a really interesting slide later that Cara's going to show you around systems thinking. Notice that the iceberg model above and below the line, and please think of this particular theme when you come to that.
Yeah.
The theme around investment in both impact and excellence. I think I've been talking, probably described quite well around the current system settings are biased towards excellence. We heard from, and just in this context too, and often when people talk about excellence in this context, they relate it to, it's become in some places synonymous with novelty, as opposed to quality, if you see what I mean. I probably haven't phrased that really well.
Rigor.
Yeah. So you hear things like, we want to create impact, but the funding system can disincentivize this, or basic but impactful science just doesn't seem to fit under the current settings. Again, I don't think that's intentional. I think it's an evolution thing. And you look at, again, you look inside some of the contracts where the milestones are more related to meeting output requirements or something around an excellence type thing, as opposed to milestones that are related to the pathway to impact. So, and this is not to say in any way that excellence isn't important. It's just that there needs to probably be a bit of a rebalance in thinking and support and emphasis around them. So the final theme is about having clear system priorities. So in my view, at the moment, a lot of the priorities, there are a lot of priorities out there in the system. There's lots of roadmaps, strategies, etc. And they list a lot of research that's important for New Zealand. So I don't doubt in any way that they are priorities. And in a sense that we do have plenty of system priorities. But the reality is, as we know, we can't afford them all. So actually, we need to prioritise. So, and I'm kind of thinking the word rank within these kind of wider system priorities, and that's something that we're really missing. Researchers are really missing. And often it really frustrates them and disheartens. Where do you put your emphasis? Even at organisational level, when you have so many priorities coming from a sector, you can end up spreading yourself quite thin, and that's we talked earlier about the interconnectedness between themes, and when you get that happening, that's when you don't necessarily get that funding stability and flexibility by being able to pull together larger pieces of work. And I think it's absolutely great that Te Awaparangi are really focusing on this. Kudos to them, and happy that we've been supporting them every which way we can. And then, as Kara talked about earlier, around even though we weren't able to fully explore this, the Māori perspective is absolutely critical, and we did hear a lot about that in our discussions. Researchers overwhelmingly see value in the T3T, the system, and Makiranga Māori, and are really keen to engage. Two key themes came through, I'd say, if I had to say what they were. One was that when working with Māori, is that whole issue around the time and resources to build and hold relationships is even more constraining than it's doubly. I talked about that earlier in an earlier theme. It's like it's kind of doubly so when working with Māori, which is great. And the other thing is we heard about how stretched Māori researchers are, and that can come at the cost of their own aspirations. I think most of us are well aware of that. And if any of you have been looking at the quotes up here, you will see the two on the right are very much speak to that. Okay, I'm just coming into that. So those are all the themes, these individual themes. So I'm just trying to do a very, very quick look before I hand over to Kara about how they fit together. So first of all, we've got we've put them together. Well, first of all, that first theme around what are all the activities we need to participate in. As part of that, we've iPEN worked on something and came up with impact creation cycle. So that's less linear than the typical input, activity, output, outcome, impact one. This talks about the whole need for relationships, about attention need to be paid to pathways, and various things along the way. So we think of it more as a cycle, and this is how we perceive that, and that's been really helpful for us. We've actually been doing knowledge that not all research needs these steps. This is the transactional type short contract doesn't need all these steps. And that pathways phrase there, that's a major pain point. And so just as our initial research and capability led to this research on systems, the systems research has actually led us to our next major project, which you'll hear from us in the next wee while, around the pathways. It's a major pain point about how to ensure uptake and use. So yes, definitely coming from us soon. And how does that cycle relate to the themes I've just been talking about? So that's how we've been picturing it. It's very simplified, non-linear process, and you can kind of see how those enabling themes, barriers, are actually important to all of the phases around the impact cycle.
And that greasing, like if you, that sort of notion of it being a wheel and the greasing the wheel so that goes around really well, like that for me I find that a really helpful way to think about how these all kind of support one another. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly, and there's no, and don't look for any relationships about where they sit around the wheels. Just think in those moving parts, and in fact, the great segue into what Kara's about to talk about. It's a system, and this is how systems tend to work.
Yeah.
And it's what we're working in. It's complex, it's messy, and on that note, I'll hand over to Kara.
Cool. Okay. So we brought a systems perspective. You can apply systems thinking at different points for different purposes, but and we use some systems thinking to support an analytical process, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. But one of the key things that we didn't do all of this just for fun to go, oh, what's the problem? What's the problem or the opportunity here? It's all about the so what next? What could we do to help support more impact? And so the strong motivation for applying the sort of systems thinking approach that we did here was to really help identify where would be good or better places to sort of focus effort so that we're going to get the best bang for our buck in a nutshell. But first, in terms of just systems thinking and linking it back to our themes. So Ross talked about the iceberg model, and some of you might be aware of that, but it's a really useful analogy that is kind of, for me, is quite fundamental to what it means to think in systems. And what it's all about is that you have the stuff that you can see sitting above the line and with an iceberg. There's all this other stuff that's sitting under the water that you can't see, but it is there, and it's got a force. It's helping to it influences the direction of the iceberg and so on. So what you can see here on the left hand side is it's by a group of people, some of whom you'll know. They're all well known in the systems world, and they took the concept of the iceberg and they flipped it into a resource called Water for Systems Change, which they wrote to try and be accessible, particularly in the sort of philanthropic sector and people who are interested in sort of funding social impact, that kind of stuff. And they identified what they call the 6 conditions for systems change. So it's taking the iceberg model and identifying 3 layers. So there's the structural change. So that's often the stuff that you can see. And so that's the equivalent sitting at the top of the iceberg. Then relational change. So, and you can see here relationships, connections, power dynamics, and deep down there is mental models or mindsets. And so what you'll see, and if you bring up the next couple of bits, Ross, is we did use this partly to guide how we kind of identified the themes. So some of them sit more at that structural change level, some sit at that relational change level, and some sit much deeper down at that mindsets or mental models level. And so what that tells us is that some of these will take more effort for longer if we're going to kind of see change happening in those areas, which will then leverage the change that we want, which is I'll come to that point in a moment. So to build on the iceberg concept and the impact creation cycle, as Ross was talking about before, what we found as we were kind of developing all of this is that there was this really kind of natural mapping of the impact creation cycle and the concept of the iceberg. And so if you imagine, we've rotated it around a little bit here, and you can see the inputs, activities, and outputs. That's all the stuff that you can see. And actually, that's the stuff that ends up being focused on in our science system. So that's where the current focus of funding, management and accountability sits. And so institutions naturally kind of arrange themselves at that level. And so we've found this quite helpful to, when you're asking yourself the question, but why is it like that? It's kind of because it's almost like a self-reinforcing loop in some respects. So the focus actually becomes about science production as opposed to impact creation. Now, just really quickly, in terms of us thinking about, okay, well, how might we help identify things that we can do to support impact? We went to Donella Meadows, who some of you might know about. She was one of the authors for Limits to Growth. And in 1999, she developed this set of leverage points, 12 leverage points. Now, these were really helpful and they map to the iceberg, and you can see them here. Now, a lot of this, there's a lot of words there, it's a little bit hard. So there's been a couple of iterations of this, which we built on as we were thinking about our own, so what. So if you go to the next slide, Ross, others have kind of took those 12 leverage points and have kind of transposed them to show this notion of, like literally leverage with the fulcrum there, and have kind of shown where they sit. And the further up the seesaw, as we call it, those are harder changes to achieve, but they are also the most powerful in terms of getting systems change. So we ran with this concept because we found that helpful, but we did flip it around, mainly because we tend to read from left to right. And so what that meant is that we saw that, if we want to really maximize the potential for change in the system to get greater impact, then we need to be thinking about each of these different pieces and thinking about, well, what could we be doing to help support change at those different levels? Now, one thing I would just stress that the notion of leverage points, sometimes people think, oh, well, we can't, why are we bothering with all this stuff down at the materials and the processes end? That's not taking a systemic thinking approach. You need to be doing interventions at all places because they are actually interrelated. But it's knowing that if all of the focus is only happening down at that shallower end, you are not going to get that much change. So you're wanting to really look at seeing change happening at multiple points across that seesaw, if you like. So if you go to the next slide, so then what we did, and we've shared this with MB, we've talked it through with the CEs, and this continues to sort of guide our own thinking about what might be the next thing that iPEN can do alongside the other kind of BAU work we do. We identified 8 opportunities for action, 3 of which, as we were working these through, we realised were actually already in focus as part of the Te Ara Pairangi work, and also just the ongoing work that iPEN was doing. So actually there's some, if you think about, we know that there's some changes at that intent end with the research priorities, and also a much stronger focus about embedding Te So great, some of the themes that came through, there's already seems to be changes planned in the system that should be powerful. But we also identified 5 other areas that should ideally also be focused on in some way, shape or form. And this is when we're talking about taking a systems view, that means it's not just about what iPEN individuals can do. This is about how all of the actors in the system might be able to respond to a piece of research like this. It's thinking about, changing some of that intent and design about where the investment goes and the type of science and research and the activities that are being supported, how the, reward and recognition is for impact is designed into the system, and then the processes that will support that. the funding flexibility, and we'll be we're in the process of organising a webinar that shows how that can be done and what it looks like, and a couple of other funding arrangements. So hopefully in a couple of months, in November, we hope to have that for you. Making space for strong relationships, and then how do you stitch it all together? So reinforcing that all with those sort of feedback loops. So that's the real whistle-stop tour of our piece of research and our application of the systems thinking to address the so what. But now we'd really love to open up for questions and discussion. So at this point, some of you might like to put comments or reflections or questions into the chat, but we would also really welcome people just to take themselves off mute, put your camera on if you want to, and actually, ask us a question. Oh, Sheena's got her hand up. Hi, Sheena.
Kia ora, I'm Sheena from GNS Science. Nice to see you all. Hey, this is something we've been grappling with internally as well. So I have 2 questions. One, I'm not sure who you spoke to within GNS Science, but also 2, the whole internal reward and incentive structure to really think about impact is something that we've been grappling with. And I'm aware of how some of the universities do it versus Crown Research Institutes, but if you have any insights or advice on the different models that you've seen, not just in New Zealand, but internationally, just so we can, kind of have a look at what else might be working out there, that would be extremely useful.
Yeah, Ross, do you want do you want to say? I've got a few thoughts I can add.
Yeah, Kara's probably got more to say on that than me, but I would just say from I haven't delved into that very deeply personally, but I know it's complex, and I know that there's some really good initiatives going on around the CRIs looking at things like internal recognition, probably more through award ceremonies or like that. And also I'm kind of wondering if narrative CVs is part of that picture as well in the academic system, or aspects of narrative CVs.
Yeah, the narrative CVs has certainly been an evolution since, which has happened since we kicked this work off, that, that's definitely a positive that sits in that category. One of the things from an iPEN point of view that we do is, like, a lot of this, some of the stuff it kind of knew about it, but this has kind of given us a bit more of an explicit structure to say, yes, this isn't just a feeling that we've got. This is a consistent challenge. And so what iPEN has been doing then is that it allows for some more structured conversations that we are able to set up as part of the way that we kind of structure and run ourselves as a kind of a collaborative network. And so we've had some dedicated discussions on that with the view to sharing, at least between the iPEN members across the 7 CRIs, what are some common, what are ways that people are kind of getting around that. So it's kind of ideas sharing, but not necessarily coming up with the solutions. But what I would say is, go to your iPEN rep and say, hey, what have you heard from the iPEN team that might shed some light on what others are doing here?
I think too, it's really interesting from a kind of a system or wider perspective, in terms of, people tend to manage what they can measure, and around kind of the excellence thing, there's some pretty well known metrics, or it's pretty, citations, etc. But it's a huge issue that everyone's grappling with for a number of reasons. And I mean, just kind of made that connection now with your question, that actually it's hard to measure outcomes and impact. And so therefore, how do you make it part of a PA discussion, or how do you make it a KPI or a whatever? So I think that's a huge work in progress.
Some other work that we are doing, and these are all, I would describe a lot of the work that iPEN's doing, is we're kind of constantly nudging lots of little balls along. So sometimes it feels like we're not making nearly as much progress as we would like to. But one of the areas that's directly in relation to your comment, Sheena, is a lot of it's about making what's counted is what's visible. And if you think about the iceberg model, it's about how do we make the invisible stuff easier to see and to then acknowledge. And so we do have some ongoing conversations about that. We've got Daniel, who's actually in Ross's team, who's done some really interesting formative work, which we hope to come back to either later this year or early next year, about different ways that outputs can be outputs in a very, very general kind of concept, how you might categorize them so you can actually start to see and recognize some of the other things that people are doing. And that way, then, if the organization has the willingness, so the organizational mindset, if you like, they can, they might be able to then say, right, well, in addition to counting, publications, we're interested also in seeing what you've done in this area and this area and this area. And so that's where it's a good illustration of where you need to see changes at multiple sort of points on that seesaw. You need to have the organization say, and the system ideally saying, this stuff is important, we care about it, and then have the processes sort of set up to kind of enable that to happen. So it's something that we are working on, but we don't necessarily have any answers for right now.
I wasn't.
Yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't expecting answers, but what you said around like what are other people doing, right? So rather than inventing something that's going to be out of step with other public research organizations, it's just if it's captured somewhere or whatever what others are doing, that would be very helpful.
Yeah. And we've just got, Maureen, so AgResearch is another organisation who are doing some reviews. So then often iPEN can sometimes be a bit of a useful conduit to help connect up some of these conversations across the CRIs too. Richard's got his hand up. Richard, hi.
Great. Thank you very much for another excellent presentation. Two of your themes that you identified, which are critical for impact, obviously is stakeholder relationships. And then the second one was the continuity and flexibility of funding. And in terms of the areas that you, I believe, require more focus, you have identified flexibility, but not continuity. And to my mind, it's that continuity of funding that's really important to be able to maintain those relationships between one block of funding and another. Even with 5-year endeavour funding, you get to the end of that 5-year cycle, and those relationships may still just be developing, and all of a sudden you have no funding to continue those relationships, and often the institutes have to bear the costs in an interim period. Have you got any thoughts about how we can improve continuity, long-term funding for some of this critical work, particularly around stakeholder relationships?
That is such a tough question.
I know.
We agree. We agree.
We agree. Hey, look, I can't give you an answer to that, but I can give you a couple of things that I think about sometimes. One is, obviously funding constraints are at the bottom of all of this, and we know there's huge challenges around that for us as a society, effectively. The other thing is, because we've developed ourselves into a place where traditionally science that's not been a big part of science investment, and if we want to begin to invest more in things like relationships and some of these other activities, it has either got to be more investment or somewhat of a trade-off in our time. So that's it's not an answer really, but I think the reality is it does take time and resource. So it's either going to be more money or some sort of a trade-off. I think we can do that as a system, but you can do that at all levels, and there's nothing stopping well, there are things stopping you, making it difficult,
Mm.
but there is scope, I think, at all levels in the system, including at the project level, to make conscious trade-off around that.
Yeah. And I would just say on that point as well that it, and this is where I find the leverage point, you know, and the seesaw really helpful, is if the system's mindset recognizes the fundamental importance of those relationships as a critical enabler, then it becomes, well, okay, well, how do we design this, the design stuff and then the enabling processes so that that's not buggered up
and and it comes back to the iceberg model, you know, the one that Cara showed about, you know, the top of the iceberg where the system or everything seems to focus is around that kind of more science production rather than the impact creation.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about there, and there's a lot to take away. So thank you very much for that.
If you come up with an answer, please share.
I think there's perhaps not one silver bullet, but there's a whole raft of things that can be done that hopefully will, you know, provide a more holistic improvement.
Yes.
And on that note too, there's a little thing in the chat there about, you know, these are important findings. Have you shared them with the MB? Well, yes, we have. We certainly have. We've had some great workshops with them. We found them great to work with. Really good. But you know, we've been emphasising with MB, and we do again now, that because it's a system, you know, in a system you have to pay attention to all of such things, as we pointed out today. So if you did everything else around that and you didn't change the KPIs, you kind of fall into a KPI trap, as Sudesh would talk about. So so you can actually change parts of the system, but by not changing other bits of the system, you can undermine what you're trying to do as a whole. So that's kind of one of the key things we talk about, and hopefully that speaks to your comment there too, Richard.
And then you find yourself in the baby with the bathwater scenario where people think something's not working because it wasn't the right thing, but actually it's the other bits in the system that haven't kind of been considered and how they support those things. So you do find that people go, oh, well, that's not working, we should chuck it. And it's like, well, hold on, let's find out why it's not working first before we kind of come to any hasty decisions. And so that's where the very practical value of thinking a bit more systemically is really helpful, because you're not constantly redesigning things that might have actually worked if there'd just been a little more consideration for some of those other parts in the seesaw. So it's 1 o'clock. So we'd better say thank you very much for coming. We hope that that's been enjoyable. Normally we would have we'd be letting you know what our next webinar is coming up, but we're just in the final sort of trying to finalize that at the moment. So when we send out our next newsletter, which will be in about a week's time, you should be able to get that information then, or otherwise just go onto Eventbrite, which you can access from the homepage on iPEN's website, plus a variety of other ways. Any questions, get in touch with Chanel. But otherwise, thank you very much for coming. We hope that you found that provocative, stimulating, interesting, validating, useful. And if you want to talk any more about these things, you know how to get in touch with us.
And if you want to share it with colleagues within your organisation, the papers are on our website. So feel free to delve into them at will.
So thank you very much all. Have a lovely rest of your day. And we'll see you again in about 4 weeks' time. Ka kite anō, everyone.
Sure.